Where we left off last time, King David is succeeded by his son Solomon. Solomon comes to power because he has his mother Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan, and the general of the Karatites and Peletites, the professional army, Benaiah, on his side. That's a good combination if you want to be king. And he began, you'll recall, by executing Joab, who was the general who opposed him. He executes his brother Adonijah, who was the brother who was the main challenger for the throne. And there's one other person he has to deal with, and that was Abiathar. Remember? He was one of the two high priests of David who opposed him, right? The other high priest was Zadok, who was the Aaronid priest. And this was Abiathar, who was a Mushite priest, and from northern Israel. Now, it's one thing to execute your brother and to execute a general of the army, but executing the high priest of Israel is really pushing the limits. So he does not execute Abiathar, he banishes him away from Jerusalem, not out of the country. There's no case of exile in the Bible imposed for a crime. But he banishes him to his family property at a city called Anatot, which is to this day, it's a village, it's a small town, sort of northwest of Jerusalem. I want you to remember that. The last known member of the Mushite priesthood is located at this city, Anatot. That will come up later. So he doesn't get executed, but now only Zadok is a high priest in Jerusalem, which is to say it is the priests who trace their descent from Aaron, the Aaronids, who are in power at the temple in Jerusalem. And the priests who trace their descent from Moses, the Mushites, they're out. Now this happens in religion, that there are divisions and different movements and different leaders, and sometimes it's matters of principle that separate groups. Sometimes it's power struggles that go on within the church, the priesthood, the synagogue, the religious movement. These things happen. It's a part of the politics of religion, and in this case, it's part of the religion of politics. And just remember, though, that this is going to make a big difference as to who's in charge with this new king. Now, Solomon does a series of other things to firm up his kingdom. And one is a series of foreign marriages. The biblical number that ascribes 1,000 women to him is maybe true, maybe, an exaggeration. Our greatest American writer, Mark Twain, has a piece about this where he talks about Solomon as the king of Israel, and he said, and it's in Mark Twain's book called Letters from the Earth, which are these letters written by one of the archangels, Satan, to the others, Gabriel and Michael. And Satan is he's down on earth checking things out, and he says, you just wouldn't believe these humans, how dumb they are, and they really don't understand the laws of God, which are the laws of nature, which are placed in them. And they keep thinking this book is the law instead. And he says, for example, he says, a law of nature is, in sex, is it all right for me to speak about sex? In sex, a woman is capable of having sex many more times a day than most any man. And he says, what would any logical creature conclude from this? That a woman should get to have many husbands. He says, what do you think these humans do? They have, when they say polygamy, they mean a man having many wives. And he says, and the worst case was this man Solomon in the Bible. He says, this man had 1,000 wives. And he says he never saw the day that he could have satisfied one of them. And he had 1,000 of them. He said, which just mathematically means that some of them must have gone for years without any sexual satisfaction. And he could look on this misery all day And it didn't bother him. And on top of that, he'd have these guards for the women. And what were these men? Eunuchs. So they're placed, the castrated men are placed in front of these, they see these big, beautiful men in front of them all day who can't do for them. And at the end of this long thing where he's going on and on about this, he says, "Until now I have argued that man is a fool. I now submit woman is a damned fool." So that's, you can read that for yourselves. You notice I look strangely like him. Mark Twain, not Solomon. You know. Mark Twain, Nietzsche, and Groucho are the three people resemble. And it's not by chance either. Yeah. So that was Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx was one of a group called the Marx Brothers. Groucho, Chico, not Chico, Harpo, Zeppo, and Gummo. When men were men and comedy was comedy. So the point of the big marriage thing, though, is it says he has 700 wives and 300 concubines. And what's the difference between the 700 wives and the 300 concubines is the 700 wives are all princesses. They're all the daughter of some king. Remember, every local city in the Near East has its own king. So they're political marriages. Indeed, it notes that one of them was the daughter of Pharaoh. If that's a true report, that's a big deal, because pharaohs were not big on marrying their daughters to foreign kings, whereas other groups have always, it's the history of the world, this political marriages, these are done to this day. But pharaohs, because Egyptians were they were sort of like the ultimate national chauvinists. I mean, the Egyptians referred to the Greeks as those uncircumcised dogs. I mean, you know, they were really, Egypt was the place. And so if it's true, it could be that it was actually in this period where Egypt was at a weaker point than it had been at other times in its history. And Israel, if the report is correct of David and Solomon, they have virtually an empire. Not virtually, they have an empire. And so it's a possibility. In any event, a foreign king is less likely to go to war against you if you're married to his daughter. What else does he do? He makes economic policies that strengthen his kingdom. One of them is he goes into the chariot business. He truly takes advantage of Israel's location. Now, I've told you before, Israel's located at the point where Europe, Asia, and Africa meet. So here he is. He gets the great Arabian horses from the Arabian Peninsula. He gets chariots from Egypt, and then he sells them to Mesopotamia and north. So he's put the economic advantage of Israel's location to use. Also, to protect the country, he builds fortifications around it, so he builds it up now as a strong, independent place. Control of some of the areas that his father had weakened. It says that Edom gets sort of semi-independence when they had been conquered by David. In Aram, the capital of Damascus, what is today Syria, he loses it, and it becomes independent from Israel. He does trade. It says he puts a fleet on the Red Sea. So when you picture that map, okay, so remember the western arm of the Red Sea is here. The eastern arm is here. So the southernmost point of Israel would be right there. And Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River. Now up here is the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians were great shipbuilders and seamen. They did, in fact, send ships out across the Mediterranean. So they build him ships, and he puts the ships here on the Red Sea, which enables him to carry on trade down in Africa. So he's doing a lot right. The chariot business, the fleet on the Red Sea. He does copper, goes into the copper business. You can go to southern Israel and see what are claimed to be King Solomon's mines, and he controls the trade route, which presumably means you have to pay to go through there. Now that all sounds pretty smart, and Solomon is famous for wisdom. And part of this also, it's attributed later to King Hezekiah, that part of the ancient Near East you're supposed to say if you have a great king, it's that he's very powerful, he's very successful, and also he's very wise. And a king has wisdom, writes Proverbs. And so, yeah, the book of Proverbs in the Bible, some trace to King Solomon. The wisdom story that's told is not the most likely story in the world to be the case. It seems like a classic fable folk tale, but I don't know. The story is, the way they told it to me in Sunday school was these two women come to him, and they have one baby between them, and they each claim to be the mother of that baby. And they come to the king for judgment. And even I, as a kid, thought, how does a thing like that happen? The two women both say the baby is theirs, and there's no witness or anybody to know the answer to this question. And where are the fathers, and so on. But they didn't tell me in Sunday school that it is two prostitutes. And it's that they live in the same location, and they each gave birth around the same time. And one of them says, well, she rolled over in her sleep, because the baby would sleep with the mother. They didn't have fancy cribs and strollers and Huggies and Enfamil. And see, I know about this stuff. I've been around that rodeo twice. And she says, well, she smothered her baby by accident in her sleep, so she took her dead baby and put it next to me and took my live baby. But mine is the live baby. The other says, she's not telling the truth, the live baby is mine. So Solomon says a very simple solution to this. And he calls for a sword. He says, well, cut the baby in half. You'll get half, and you'll get half. And the first one says, oh, yeah, okay, that's fair. Wait, horizontal or vertical? No, I added that. So, and the second one says, no, that's terrible. Don't do that to the baby. I'm the liar. She's the true one. Give her the baby. And Solomon in his wisdom says, the second one is the true mother. And it's this, kind of story. And there is this variation on it. These two Orthodox Jewish boys in the old country are betrothed to two women in the next village over. So they set off to meet their intendeds, because it's an arranged marriages. And there's a terrible blizzard, and one of them is lost. So only one groom shows up for the two potential brides. So the two potential mothers-in-law are fighting, each insisting that this is the groom who was intended for her daughter. So they go to the rabbi. And the rabbi says, well, we have a biblical precedent for this. We'll cut the groom in half. Half will be married to your daughter, and half will be married to your daughter. And the first one says, no, that's terrible. You don't have to do that. Okay, let him marry her daughter. And the second one says, no, wait, it's fair. Your daughter gets half, and my daughter gets half. And the rabbi says, the second one is the true mother-in-law. That joke gets funnier after you've been married, The other thing about Solomon, perhaps the most famous, is that he builds the temple in Jerusalem. David kept the ark in Jerusalem, which was a big step, but he kept it there in a tent, as it had been in the early days. So there are these periods, like the whole wilderness period, where the ark is kept in a tent. And then there was the period at Shiloh where it was in a temple. And it strangely is referred to at Shiloh as both a temple in one passage and as a tent, a tabernacle, in another. And I'll explain that around lecture 20 or so. And Solomon, though, builds a temple in Jerusalem. Now, people misunderstand some of this about what a temple constitutes in the ancient world. The temple is not really big. It's, the measurements are given in 1 Kings 6, and it's 20 cubits wide by 60 cubits long and 30 cubits tall. So a cubit is 1.5 feet. Cubit is 18 inches. So a temple that's 20 cubits wide, right? That's 30 feet wide. That's what? That's about this room. It's not that big, really. And 3 times the length. And the height is 30. Now, you can't get many people in there. But you didn't have to get many people in there because the temple works the same as the tabernacle did. Only the priests go in. Everything that happens is out in the courtyard, and it describes how there's the building, that's the temple, and then there's this big courtyard marked out all around it. And the altar where you do sacrifices is out in the courtyard. You can't do sacrifices inside a building. The blood, the smoke, I mean, even though if you use incense to cover it, you're still talking about, over centuries of blood and smoke in a building. It wouldn't be like the most attractive place. It is a small place. It is a shrine that houses the ark. And you can't go in. You go, well, how does that work then? What's interesting is, so let's say this building, right, 20 wide by 60 long. Here's the front. And there are these 2 giant columns, it says, which have names at the entrance. And the Holy of Holies is the back 20. So this back part is called the Holy of Holies, or it's a Hebrew for the holiest of holies. And it has an entranceway. All right, so there's a door there. And it's apparently 10 cubits up from the floor. So you would go in, and then there'd be stairs going up 10 cubits, and then it's 10 cubits cubed above that, right? Because the building is 30 high. The first 10 aren't part of that room. And so this room is 10 by 10 by 10. And it has the ark here, and the ark is under the wings of the cherubs. A cherub, biblically, you remember them? They were at the Garden of Eden, guarding the path to the tree of life. They are sphinxes, head of a human, body of a 4-legged animal, wings of a bird. And the 2 giant ones, 10 cubits tall, it says, with their wings spread over the ark in the middle. And there are many Psalms, if you look in the book of Psalms, where there are references to God, I love the place in the shelter of your wings, the hidden place under your wings. And those are entirely likely to be references to the cherubs. In fact, there's good evidence that they are references to what's going on in there. And then under them right there is the ark. Now, you can't go in, but can you see it? Right? You can't touch. You can't enter. But if you want to get a sense of what this was like, go to Harvard. Go into Harvard Yard. In Harvard Yard, the biggest building is the Widener Library. The Widener Library is named for Harry Elkins Widener, who was from a young man, college student at Harvard, of an extremely wealthy American family. And he went over to Europe, and he was coming back on this really great new ship called the Titanic. And he died. He went down with the Titanic. And his mother, Mrs. Widener, dedicated this library to her son, Harry Elkins Widener's memory. And she had a certain number of requirements, because as people give great sums of money to universities, often, they want some requirement. So one of her requirements was anyone who ever graduates Harvard has to pass a swimming test. So this is true. Before you can graduate Harvard, there's this thing where you have to swim a certain distance, the length of the pool, or you don't graduate. And you go, we've all seen the movie. I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio went down. I mean, it didn't matter if he could swim or not in the North Atlantic, But that's the requirement, so everybody has to pass a swimming test. Another requirement is not one brick of the building can be moved or changed. So when they added on to another library, the Pusey Library next door, and they wanted to make it possible that you could walk, across a corridor from one library to the other, they weren't allowed to cut the wall and make a doorway. So you go in through a window. You go up at this sort of stairs, and then there's this window that's been opened up, and then you cross through to the other library. But the main thing, which is why is he telling us this story, is if you go to the Widener Library, it's constructed like this. If you stand in Harvard Yard, at the foot of the library, you should all do this. You go and you stand at the foot of the library, then there's a bunch of stairs, and then there's the big doors of the library, and then they open, and then there's more stairs. And up at the top of those stairs is the rare book room. And if the doors of that are open, you can look into the rare book room, and there's a fireplace on the back wall, and over the fireplace is a painting of Harry Elkins Widener. So that standing down here, you can look up into the building and into the secret Holy of Holies and the shrine to Harry Elkins Widener at the top. If that effect is impressive, compare that, to this, which is much, much better, I think, in my opinion, having never seen this one, but I've seen the one at Harvard. You all know about the statue in Harvard Yard? So when he builds the temple, a couple things happen. He makes a temple dedication speech. That is in 1 Kings 8. So it's a brand new temple, a brand new king, and the king makes this speech on the occasion of the dedication of the temple. So this is a big event. And in it, he says to God, what is the point of my building you a temple when all the heavens and all the earth couldn't contain you? So what's the point of building a building for you? And he answers, I know that you can't reside inside this building, but could you just let your name reside in the building? And so that whenever your people are in trouble, if they turn in the direction of this building and pray to you by your name, O Yahweh, save us, then you'll hear our prayer. That's what he asks for. And that became the practice then. It was understood, we don't know exactly when it started, maybe that day, maybe later, that when Jews pray, they're supposed to face Jerusalem. If they're in Jerusalem, they're supposed to face the site where the temple is. So that's why all synagogues in North America are built so that when you're inside praying, you're facing east toward Israel. The synagogues in Israel are built so when you're inside praying, you're facing Jerusalem. Synagogues in Jerusalem are built so that you're facing the site where the temple was. Synagogues in China, you face west. Synagogues in India, you face west. So it's like everybody is focused on, and that idea is established in this temple speech, and it's called the name theology. The idea that God's name isn't just a name, but the name becomes a hypostasis. Remember, we had this term before for where something intangible becomes tangible. So an angel, I suggested, was a hypostasis of God, and sometimes fire is used as a hypostasis of God. It's the thing you can see of an unseeable thing. And so the name of God becomes one of those as well. And so it has like a substance itself. Also, it's been pointed out that if you would look at every occurrence of the name, the word name, in Deuteronomy, for example, where it says, remember, the only place where you can offer sacrifice is at the place where Yahweh causes his name to reside, or it's the word for tenting. So it's the place where God tents his name, because remember, it's kept inside a tent, a tabernacle. And if you notice that every place where it has the word name in the book of Deuteronomy, you could take out the word name and put in the word ark, and the sentence would make perfect sense. So we'll see some evidence a little further on that people would look at the ark of God and refer to it as the name, Hashem. In Hebrew, Hashem, the name. Some Jews to this day refer to God as Hashem, because they won't say Yahweh, so they say, instead of saying God's name, they say the words, the name. And apparently they did something like that then. When the ark went by, they said, oh, there goes the name, meaning the thing that houses the hypostasization of God's name. And that's called the name theology. So if we've been talking about all these different ways that God's presence is manifest in the world, in the story, now there's another one, that the name of God becomes not only, God's appellation, but it has a thing itself, like an angel does, or the fire does. It has an expression of God's existence. Can't put it much better than that. The other thing that happens is on the day of the dedication, it says the cloud and the glory of God appear. Now remember, the cloud had been leading them through the wilderness for 40 years. Then when the book of Joshua starts, the cloud appears for the last time. We haven't seen it all this time now. So we're now 300 years from Joshua to Solomon, and King Solomon is now dedicating the temple, and the cloud appears. Also this thing called the glory, whatever that is, some sort of glowing mask sort of thing so that you don't see God. So that really makes clear that we're at a turning point in history, that this isn't just a nice building that's been put up, but God is like assenting to Solomon's prayer that this is a sacred spot, the sacred spot. Now God, it says twice, appears to Solomon. It says, in other words, and the Lord appeared unto Solomon. Those are the last two times in the Bible that it says that the Lord appeared to anybody. Now remember, Solomon you're looking at 950-ish BCE when the temple gets dedicated. Remember I told you David was 1,000, and David and Solomon each had very long reigns. And so some would call it 950, but somewhere in there, a little later maybe. You've got the last two times it says, and God appeared to anybody. But the Bible's going to go down to about 400-something BCE is the end of the Hebrew Bible, which means you still got 500 years of Bible left in the story, and it's never going to say God appeared to anyone. So just as I told you to watch these gradual different ways that God appears or is made known in the Bible, take note of this. When you're halfway through the story here, not even halfway of the story of Israel and its land, God isn't appearing anymore, whatever appearing means. The first one, one of them is the first one says in a dream, and we've talked about that appearing in a dream is, well, that's fine, thank you, but it's not as cool as appearing out here. And the second one says he appeared as at the first, so it may or may not mean in a dream. But that's it. So you've got the last time that you're going to see the cloud and the glory, and the last time that you're going to get the words, and the Lord appeared to anybody, when there's still hundreds of years of the story left. So something is happening now. We're leaving that world of splitting seas and talking snakes and extraordinary things, and you're going to see fewer and fewer angels, fewer and fewer miracles, fewer and fewer appearances, no more cloud and glory. Something's happening in the world. Now, this is something that most people don't note when they read through the Hebrew Bible, because I've told you, most people don't read the whole thing as a continuous story. You learn this verse this week and that verse that week, and you go according to, is it a holiday? So you learn about, the events of the Bible related to that holiday, or it's a Sunday or a Saturday, and your priest or your minister, your rabbi picks out a verse for the day. It is unusual to step back and look at the whole flow of the story. Something is happening. There's a plot here in this story. Now, in this appearance to Solomon, then, since it's the last one, you should consider this a big deal. And whatever is said that day is big. And what it is, you should read it. It's in 1 Kings 9, especially verses 4 through 9, where God reaffirms the Davidic covenant to Solomon. So he says, you're not just the next guy on the throne. You are the covenantal heir to the throne. You are the messianic covenantal heir, the way Isaac was to Abraham, the way Jacob and not Esau was to Isaac. That a line in a covenant is crucial. And if you look at the wording, not unlike 2 Samuel 7, where you first had the covenant between God and David, it is a conditional covenant in some ways and unconditional in others. And this was only noticed in 1975 or 6, 1976, that whenever it refers to the throne or the throne of Israel, it uses conditional language. It says, if you will keep my covenant, then you will have the throne of Israel, you and your descendants after you. But whenever it's referring just to Judah and the throne just over Judah in Jerusalem, then it's unconditional language. It's even if you violate my covenant, if you break my statutes, you and your descendants will always be on the throne. So understand that, remember, originally, Judah and Israel were two separate places. Now under David and Solomon, it's one giant kingdom of Israel. But the Davidic covenant is very, very carefully worded, that the whole thing is conditional. If David or Solomon or their son or their grandson or all the way down the line don't keep the covenant, they could lose Israel. But even if they break the covenant itself, if they do terrible things, which they will, they can always keep Jerusalem as their city and Judah as their land. And that's forever. Now remember that, because obviously things are going to happen in the story that will relate to that. All right, now let's talk more about Solomon. As great as he is on the way up, like David, that's how bad he is on the way down, where things start to go wrong in the kingdom. And it starts with women. Now remember, there is a law of the king that's in Deuteronomy. And it says, remember, the king can't have a lot of horses, he can't have a lot of wives, he can't have a lot of gold and silver, he has to write out a copy of the law, he has to be native born. And Solomon has a lot of wives, a lot of gold and silver, a lot of horses. He's breaking them all. So a lot of biblical scholars have argued that, in fact, that passage in Deuteronomy saying the king has to do all those things was written in a later period precisely to denigrate King Solomon. They took all the things that he did and they said, oh, by the way, God had told Moses you're not supposed to do those things, and that's why Solomon gets into trouble later with the kingdom. It was Professor Halpern in his PhD dissertation at Harvard who argued the opposite. He said the law of the king in Deuteronomy 17 already existed, but he said it wasn't originally part of the Torah given to Moses. It was originally the law that Samuel wrote. So now you go back to the book of 1 Samuel and look at the story of where Samuel anointed Saul as the first king of Israel. God tells Samuel, but give the people the law of the king. And it says Samuel writes the law of the king and he puts it up before the Lord, which would mean at the ark. That was constitutional monarchy. That Israel, from the beginning, has a written document putting limitations on the king. We don't usually think of constitutional monarchy as existing until the Romans. And here it is, 1020 something anyway, somewhere like that, BC. So if he was right, and I think he was, it was crucial. That's why, for example, in the story of King David's defeating Edom, he captures these, it says thousands of horses, and he hamstrings all but a couple hundred. Remember? He did that because he was obeying the law of the king. It was there already, written. So then you say, well, then was Solomon dumb enough to violate the key items of the law of the king? He's supposed to be wise. And the answer is not that he was dumb for doing it, it's that he did it. He did what kings do. He got a lot of horses, a lot of women, a lot of money. And when you read the text that's being critical of him, which is in 1 Kings 11, how do you criticize a king if you want to say he did things wrong? You say he violated the Constitution. So, you know, in the President Clinton days, when there was the scandal about his affair with Monica, a lot of people, what they pulled out against it was they said, we don't care that he had an affair. That wasn't the point. Or even what the acts were, which came out, and all of that stuff. Where is privacy if not in the Oval Office? And I don't stand a chance in my house. I mean, you can't have privacy. So they said, we don't care about any of that. What we care is that he lied about it under oath. That is to say, their criticism is he violated the law. Now, I'm not taking sides in that, or who's right or who's wrong or any of that. But the principle is the same, that when you want to criticize a king or a president, a political leader, you can do it by saying, well, I criticize his scandalous behavior or his taste in women or what, that sort of thing. But it is a more effective criticism, if you're really after the person, to say, no, there was a law. And the law applies to the leader too, and the leader broke that law. So it's not that, as scholars have argued, that this law was made up to make Solomon look bad. It's that the law existed. And when the author of 1 Kings 11 wanted to say, here's what was wrong with Solomon, you pick out the things that were in the law of the king that he violated, because it doesn't matter if you pick any other law that he violated. Yeah.
So could it not also be that Samuel could have just copied the Deuteronomy passage? Or that Deuteronomy was already there, Samuel had it, and then the same effect, the author of 1 Kings.
That's interesting. That's a possibility, that it was a law that was even older than Samuel's on that occasion, and that's what Samuel took out and copied, and I have no particular objection to that. It's a possibility.
I mean,
If you ask me, do I really think that's what happened? No, I think Samuel probably wrote it, but yeah.
Well, I mean, Deuteronomy is full of prophetic language and blessings and curses and that kind of thing, so it seems reasonable that it would include something about a king.
I think it is reasonable, yeah. Now, you know we're going to have a whole section later on who wrote the Bible, so I'm going to get at this. But just for today, all I wanted to was just, so I won't get into all of Deuteronomy, but I would get into the law of the king, which, yeah, could well have been written by Samuel on that occasion, or it could be what you say, that it was a law that predated Samuel, and that was the piece he selected because it was the part about a king, and it was a king situation, so he put it there. It works for me. And that would make the law even older. So it's impressive if it's as old as Samuel. If it's as old as Moses, now you're really talking business here. But it makes more sense, at least, just the logic of it, that it would be on the occasion of establishing the first king that you'd write all the laws about the king, just as the US Constitution was written. I'm wrong already. It was the Articles of Confederation when we got our first president. So that's interesting. But that would make it later, not earlier. So forget the analogy. My analogy stinks, but the point could be that it's when you establish it that you do it. But there are a lot of laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all that are understood, presented as having come from the wilderness period before they're in their land, that give rules about what they should do when they get in the land, like the Jubilee law. So yeah, maybe monarchy too could derive from some earlier period. Yeah. It's possible. Either way, it means Israel always has constitutional monarchy. Kings are not absolute rulers. And you'll see the king struggling against that all along. You saw it already when you saw that King Saul was dependent on the leaders of the tribes if he wanted an army. Whereas David establishes these Karatites and Pelethites. He has a professional army, so he's no longer dependent on the individual tribes. That gave him autonomy as a king that his predecessor didn't have. And Solomon keeps giving himself more and more autonomy, though you're going to see things are going to go wrong because of that. And so, especially we Americans who don't have a history of kings, don't get this perhaps as well as Europeans do, that there's really no such thing as an absolute ruler, even when you look in the Middle East in recent years where there have been some dictators who've had tremendous power, or the leader of North Korea, or certain countries where they have extremely powerful leaders. They still, nobody has 100% power. They still have to worry about, relatives. Toward the end of Solomon's reign, then things start to come apart. I mentioned part was he lost Aram, right? So over here to the northeast was Aram, what is today Syria. And David, it said, had ruled that and had a garrison in Damascus. Solomon loses it and Aram becomes independent. Edom, down here, does a rebellion, and they don't get complete freedom, but there's some kind of break or semi-independence that happens under him. He continues to have Moab and Ammon under him. And it's always a little unclear about Phoenicia. One of his wives is the princess of the Phoenicians. Hiram, king of Tyre, is his father-in-law. Of course, every king in the ancient world was his father-in-law. And Hiram gives him the cedars of Lebanon, which he uses that wood in building the palace, and he helps him with the ships to put down here on the Red Sea. So he doesn't seem to dominate Phoenicia, but he has, it's called a parity treaty with them where they're more like equals. So he may not have as much territory as his father David has, but he has more power and wealth, it would appear, than David has. And he has these fortifications built around the country where he's better protected from foreign attack than David was. But all this is going to start to go wrong. And the story is that because he did so many things wrong, a prophet comes to him. The prophet first goes to another man and tells this man to oppose him. So you need to know who both of them are. The prophet's name is Ahijah. And he goes to a man who's one of the officers of Solomon, and he says to this man Jeroboam to rebel against Solomon. And he takes a cloth and he tears up the cloth and he says, into 12 pieces, he says, I'm going to give 2 pieces to Solomon and his sons and 10 to you, which means I'm going to give Solomon the south, which is just Judah and Simeon, and the 10 northern tribes are going to become a separate country ruled by Jeroboam. Jeroboam tries to do this, and he has to flee and stay down in Egypt for a while under the protection of Pharaoh, but eventually he will come back. And we'll see why it's Ahijah who's the one who does it. Now, why does this happen? According to 1 Kings 11, the reason why Solomon's kingdom is starting to come apart, and there are going to be threats now internally and externally, is that Solomon has all these wives and horses and money and stuff that he wasn't supposed to do. And so it's the hand of God. Now, at the same time, though, the story, when you read in between the lines and read all those little parts that you don't want to look at unless you're a scholar, give away another set of reasons for why this is going to happen. All these troubles where these northern tribes, Israel, are going to want to split from the southern tribes, Judah. And these have to do with economic and political policies of Solomon. So the first is, it says that Solomon has really high taxes. Now, everybody hates high taxes. You don't necessarily throw a king out because of that. But what it says is he taxes the north very heavily. Now remember, he's from Judah, but he's taxing all these northern tribes a lot. And where is he spending the money? It says he builds fortifications. And where are the fortifications? Along the border between Israel and Egypt. So he's protecting his own area from Egyptian attack. But the Egyptians aren't attacking. He's married to the Pharaoh's daughter. But it does say during this period that Aram is attacking. They broke loose and separated from Israel. And he doesn't build any fortifications here. So he's taxing these guys to protect himself down here. And he's not protecting them. And what else is he spending money on? He's spending money on building his temple here and building up the city of Jerusalem. Well, they don't live in Jerusalem. They live up there. So he's using northern money to help the south. That's mistake number one. Well, we'll decide if it's a mistake. Let's say that is policy number one. Policy number two, it says that his father-in-law Hiram, the king of Tyre, Tyre, is one of the two main cities of Phoenicians. It's in the news till this day as a city in Lebanon. It says Hiram gave him all the cedars of Lebanon and all these boats and all that sort of thing. So what did he give Hiram in return? It says he gave him 20 cities. Now think about that for a second. He takes 20 cities from northern Israel and he gives them to Phoenicia, the neighboring country. That's like if the Prime Minister of Israel today would get some stuff from Lebanon and he'd take the 20 northernmost cities in Israel and give them to Lebanon. How would the people of Israel feel about that? Right? So he's actually giving territory of Israel to another country. 20 cities, that's a lot. And what does he get in return from that? Cedar and gold. And where does the cedar and the gold go? Jerusalem. Point number three. It says that he has, in addition to the monetary taxes, he also has a labor tax. That everybody owes 1 month a year service to the king to work on these building projects. Now, the word for that, a term for labor groups, companies of labor companies that are forced labor. There's no English word for that, really. We usually use the French word corvée for that. But you could also the Hebrew word for such things are misim. 1 mas is the singular, 2 misim. Now that's forced labor. Now you go, wait a minute. These are Israelites. These are people who haven't forgotten that a key starting point of their religion is that they started out as slaves in Egypt, being forced to work for a king on his building projects. And now Solomon is forcing the Israelites to work on his building projects. And you might go, no, come on, that's not the same thing. They wouldn't connect that at all. As a matter of fact, the word that's used at the beginning of the book of Exodus for what the Egyptians did to the Israelites is they made them work in misim, the same word, the same thing. And so Solomon is being pictured here as treating his own people almost the way the Pharaoh treated them. Next point, these taxes that he was imposing on them. How does he do the taxes? It says that he divides the country, the northern part, into 12 taxation districts, and the southern part into 12 taxation districts. Now, obviously, the word 12, that number isn't just any old number. 12 was the number of the tribes. So now he has 12 taxation districts. And if you look, it gives the geographic locations of them. Some of them do overlap with tribal borders, some don't. So that would be like if the President of the United States said, we're not just going to have states anymore. Let's have taxation districts. And let's have, just pick 50. we're going to have 50 taxation districts. And over each taxation district, I appoint a head who's the head of that taxation district. And he's in charge of collecting all the taxes for that taxation district. Now, what would that do? That would undermine the governor and the senators and the congressmen from all the Congress people, from all of the states. And they wouldn't have any power anymore because they wouldn't have the money. The power would be the person who the king placed there. Thus, instead of having the elected leaders of each place leading the place, it would now be people who are appointed by the central authority. That is what Solomon does. He is redistricting Israel. So now the existing heads, like the elders of the tribes, they don't have the power anymore. It's guys appointed by the king who have the power. And there's one other thing he does, which was right at the beginning. He removed Aviatar from being the co-high priest. Now, it wasn't just that Aviatar was the Mushite and Zadok was the Aaronid. It's that Zadok came from Hebron, which was a city in the south. Aviatar, remember, was from the old priesthood of Shiloh, which was in the north. So he has eliminated the northern high priest only and kept the southern high priest. Everything I've just described to you would alienate the people of the north and say, we used to be a separate country, we got united with this other country, Judah, and now Judah's taken over everything. And they're using us. And then along comes this guy Jeroboam. And a man named Ahijah says to him, you're going to break away, make a separate country of Israel again, and you'll be the king of it. Who the heck is Ahijah to do that? If you look at the full name it gives of him, he is called Ahijah of Shiloh, that was where the old priesthood was that he comes from, that got thrown out. And it's where the Mushite priests were, who've now been thrown out in Jerusalem. They're not at the temple anymore. So it would appear that there were political and religious and economic reasons for why the north is unhappy and why they have this new leader, Jeroboam, and they lead a rebellion to separate from the kingdom of Judah and become a separate country all on their own again. And the people backing it, inciting it, if Ahijah is one of that group, then it's these Mushite priests. They're the great losers of history. They're descendants of Moses, Samuel, Eli. I mean, they have this long, great, distinguished line that they're part of, and they're out of power. And these other guys in Jerusalem control the temple and the wealth and the religion and everything. So now, if Israel will separate and become its own country, they can get to be the priests of Israel and let the other guys be the priests of Judah. Do you like the story? It's got sex, it's got religion, it's got politics, it's got all of that. So Solomon reigns for very long, and then he dies, and his son comes to the throne. And the interesting thing is, his son's name is Rehoboam. Now those names are kind of similar. Is this coincidence that the man Jeroboam, who becomes the king of Israel, and Rehoboam, who becomes the king of Judah, have names that are like part the same? And they mean roughly the same thing. Jeroboam would be Hebrew for, may my people become many, multitudes. And Rehoboam means, may my people become spread out. So each one's name means like, I should get the whole thing, right? May my people become the big one. And so it is likely that these are not the names that their moms gave them. These are throne names. And they took dueling throne names. And there's arguments for why David and Solomon also are just throne names. And it's like, you know, when, today when a new pope ascends to the papacy, the first act of each new pope is he goes away in a room, he comes out with his white garment on, And one of the cardinals says, "What do you wish to be called?" And the Pope answers, "We wish to be called." And Francis, Benedict, and so the first thing is choosing a name. And probably these were names that they chose upon becoming king, not, being born with them. And so David, for example, if you look elsewhere in the text, we didn't look at all the little stuff. There's one where it refers to a man named Elchanan during the time of David who defeats a big Philistine named Goliath. You go, wait a minute. That's not how I heard it. So either it means that there was a guy named Elchanan who was the real hero, killed Goliath, and then the king took over the hero story and it was attributed to him. Or it could be that Elchanan was his name, and David was his throne name that he took when he became king. And the name Solomon, it says explicitly that his original name isn't Solomon, it's Jedediah, who later became, now I have to go to a television show that none of you have seen, so, Beverly Hillbillies, a man named Jed. They used to sing that about Solomon. Anyway, so that is to say that each of these may be names, and if that's correct, then you have to consider this for all the other names of all the other kings you're going to have for the rest of the story. Those may be names they took when they came to the throne. And in fact, there is a lot of overlap where there'll be a king in named like Jehoram in Israel, and overlapping with him, there'll be a king named Jehoram in Judah. And it seems they're deliberately choosing names that compete. So Rehoboam comes to the throne, and the people say to Rehoboam, according to the story, your father Solomon's really hard on us. He taxed us, he made us work, did all these terrible things. If you'll go easier on us, we'll stick with you. But if you're going to be like your father, we're splitting. So it says that Rehoboam has two sets of advisors. One are the old guys who advised his father all those years. And one are the young guys he grew up with, went to school with, and, younger, tough guys. And the old guys say, listen, promise them anything in an election year. You want them to accept you as king, so tell them, oh yeah, I'll be much nicer than my father. I'm going to, a chicken in every pot, free taxes, no more taxes, you don't have to worry, whatever you want. And then once you're king and you got the army and you're firmly established, then you do whatever the heck you wanted anyway. Now, the politicians have never actually done this, but that was the advice that they gave him. But the young advisors said to him, do not do this. They are testing you as a young king, and you've got to show them who's boss. So you should tell them you're going to be tougher than your father. So Rehoboam listens to the younger guys because he is stupid. And he says to the people, my little finger will be thicker than my father's thigh, which is a sexual reference. I'm more of a man than my father. So my father used whips on you, I'm going to use scorpions on you. This is the language he gives them. This is not how you win over people. And so it says all of Israel stands up and say, what portion do we have in David, meaning the dynasty of David? And they break and they form their own country. And so this line is redrawn between the two, and Judah and Israel become separate countries again. And Jeroboam is the king of Israel, and Rehoboam is the king of Judah. The line of David, the dynasty that was promised, it is unconditional. That is, no matter what Solomon did wrong, his son still inherits the kingdom of Judah, and Jerusalem is the capital. But the north of Israel, they're separate. And they have this King Jeroboam, and he makes his own capital, which is right around in the middle, and it is the city of Shechem. Remember, that was the place where Dinah was avenged by her brothers because she was with a man named Shechem from the city of Shechem. It's still there in Israel. You can go to Shechem. It's called Nablus today. And what is the dividing mark, the thing that establishes the separation of northern Israel from Judah? It says that Solomon sends a man named Adoram, one of the unimportant, non-remembered people of the Bible. He sends a man named Adoram to the northern kingdom of Israel as an official of his, and they stone Adoram to death. They kill him. And why? Who is the heck Adoram? It says Adoram, if you look in the list of Solomon's officials, Adoram was the head of the Misim. That was their way of saying, doesn't work. We don't want any part of that. Now, Jeroboam becomes the king of Israel. What he should do, presumably, is get these guys, Ahijah's guys, Abiatar's guys, the Mushite priests, and make them the priests of Israel, and the Aaronid guys would be the priests of Judah. But it says that Jeroboam establishes two new places of worship. One at Dan, which is the northernmost city of Israel, and one at Bethel, which we know already, that was the place where Jacob had the dream of the angels going up and down the staircase or the ladder or whatever it is. And that's here, Bethel. That's a hyphen. That is to say, instead of having one central religious place like Jerusalem in the south, he has one that's the northmost city and one is the southernmost city, so that you can imagine God enthroned over the whole land. Now, how does that work? If you look in the temple in Jerusalem, if you do that Harry Elkins Widener thing and you look up, there are these golden cherubs. Cherubs, you'd say, but how can you have those? Those are like images in the temple. But no, it's because the cherubs are not gods. They are non-existent real creatures that are the throne platform on which God is invisibly enthroned. So he's going to do that too. He puts up a gold statue at Dan and a gold statue at Bethel. The cherubs have been used already. So he used the second most common symbol that was used for the presence of a god on a throne platform, golden calves. He puts a golden calf, a young bull of gold, at Dan and one at Bethel. And you go, was he crazy? Didn't he know the story about Aaron? And the answer is no, he didn't. You'll find out why in the next lecture.